welcome everybody to this fresh episode of the Cosmopolis. Uh, as we have always maintained that Cosmopolis means having as wide a range of subjects as possible. Like we have everything from science, technology, and obviously history and philosophy. And I think our conversation today would kind of straddle across many such fields. And it's a pleasure for me to have amidst us Professor Faisal Devji. I could give you a very lengthy introduction, but I will make it as succinct as possible. He's teaching Indian history. He's a professor of Indian history at the University of Oxford, and he's worked on a variety of subjects, including, the history of Islam, the questions of modernity, very broadly speaking. He's also written on, many journalistic forums in many magazines. So has a very prominent public voice now. But for me, I'll come straight to the point why I was most excited to have him at Alliance is that on all these issues which somehow or the other confront us, he seems to be having a position that eludes any pro or contra kind of category, and yet he still remains provocative in a very refreshing way. So that I think really makes him stand out and his work stand out for all of us here. And so Professor Devji, thanks you again for being here.
Thank you.
So I'll start right away with the essay that I really loved reading, and I'll start with one of your popular writings. This is an essay you wrote in the Aeon on the idea of the West, where you do a wonderful, very revealing, deconstruction about how the very concept of the West is something that has changed over the years, like whether it was contained in Europe geographically, and then how the Americans changed its meaning, and then how the Cold War changed its meaning and stuff like that. And the most immediate thought that came to me was, if we could now think of the idea of the South, something which I was speaking to you about yesterday as well. Given that even that category, the South, is going through those very, very strange, changes. Like I was telling you recently that the Indian Prime Minister is calling for a kind of an international coalition of the global South. And as I told you that was a phrase I had heard only amongst a very select group of academics earlier. And suddenly we have this very political usage of that term. So, I mean, if you could just start off with some thoughts on that note, like what do you think of this concept of the South?
Well, thank you very much. That's really an interesting question. I mean, if I'm correct, the term South, now of course it has the word global affixed to it, but it didn't always. So it starts really becoming popular from the 1980s to divide the globe or the world into North and South rather than East and West. And so North and South were seen as being not only more appropriate categories, appropriate in the sense that they supposedly distinguished between wealthier countries. It was more an economic designation. Developed countries, let's say, which is also the term of the day, and underdeveloped countries. And this was meant to be a more accurate division of the world than the much older and more historically freighted one of East and West, which came along with civilizational associations, Eastern civilization, Western civilization, Eastern spirituality, Western rationality, etc. So none of these civilizational identities were linked to North and South. So it was seen as being a much more neutral and institutionally appropriate, therefore, usage. And if I'm not mistaken, it comes to be developed in these UN-type multilateral international forums. So I recall when my family moved to Canada, I was a kid in the 1980s. Then Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was a fan of using this kind of designation of South, North and South. So it developed, to repeat, as a way of setting aside what appeared to be the more problematic aspects of the East-West distinction. And yet, of course, it repeats them insofar as it's a dualistic category. It divides the world into two. And just as with East and West, North and South cannot really be geographically configured with any degree of accuracy. So Japan and South Korea and Taiwan are in the global North, though they might be physically in the global South or surrounded by global South countries. You don't seem to have that kind of problem in the so-called global North, but maybe countries like Albania, North Macedonia, etc., which are part of Europe, but may not be seen as belonging to the global North in any distinct way. So North-South, possesses a similar set of ambiguities as East-West, though it doesn't have the civilizational baggage that the former set of terms continues to have. So what I think will be interesting is if this civilizational language, which seems to be back with us today, especially today, Russia poses itself as a civilizational state. China poses itself, interestingly, as a civilizational state, even though as a communist one, it has a global narrative of its own, which is communism, but it doesn't use it internationally, it uses it only domestically. Internationally, it uses the civilizational language of Asian values. And of course, again, probably since the late 1980s, and certainly after 9/11 and the emergence of global forms of terrorism, we have the return of Western civilization and Europe as a civilizational figure. So all over the world, the category of civilization has returned. But the category of East and West is not as prominent as it once was. So the question I have in this transition is A, is it really a transition? And B, might we end up seeing these civilizational categories being appended to the North-South distinction as they were to the East-West one? I don't think it's possible to do, because North-South do not configure civilizationally. But the return of civilization, I think, does suggest the limitations of the North-South distinction. And yet you have the Indian Prime Minister you mentioned, for instance, makes use occasionally in domestic politics of a civilizational language. But as you say, internationally he deploys this North-South distinction, which apparently doesn't have a civilizational set of identities fixed onto it. So it's very interesting what's happening there. Globally, North-South seems to have legs. So whether you're looking at the war in Ukraine or that in Gaza, it's North-South that is invoked when thinking about these conflicts globally. And the problem from the point of view of countries in the North is that the global South seems not to be in support of Northern motivations, intentions, and assistance in both those conflicts. So it might well be that the problems of the East-West division are being replicated at some other level with the North-South one, insofar as this is no longer a distinction of developed and underdeveloped countries, which is what its intention had been, that it is no longer a technocratic distinction. It's coming to be, if not a civilizational one, certainly a political one. Though the question, of course, remains is that what integrity does the global South possess? What integrity does the global North possess? Well, it possesses some, because the global North is interlinked by a web of alliances. and uniform, well, not uniform, but congruent forms of political debate and votes at the United Nations, etc. The global south is now increasingly linked, though only occasionally, by votes at the United Nations, but is not linked by any other congruent political or other narratives. Yeah. So it remains a kind of half-formed category, but it'll be interesting to see how it might develop, and it is quickly developing at the moment.
Yeah. In fact, now because we're in Bangalore, and in some of your work you've spoken about the work of language, the tech capital of Bangalore has its own registers. And there's this phrase, I don't know if you've heard of it, which is very popular here. It's called double clicking on something. So, what I wanted you to do in my notes earlier is that if you could, for us, double click a little bit on this concept of civilization, because there's a lot of ambiguity around who does that work. In India, as you know, we were discussing, there's this talk of an index civilization. Even your own work on Gandhi, would you say that he was also a thinker, of a civilizational thinker, insofar as he was drawing from some kind of Indian text, or was he something else? So if you could, what exactly is this creature called civilizational thinking? Because in at least one of my interests has also been about the more stark questions that need to be asked when you ask questions around science, for example. Given the absolute consensus we have around the sort of the utility of technological advances and the sciences it is based upon, do we then ask civilizational questions about, well, let us have our own science and consequently our own technology? And this is also a question which you deal in your work, that people, while they're asking civilizational questions, whether it is in Islam, how they still manage to then have this relationship with technology. So if you could please talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, to start with Gandhi, of course, he's, as you know, famous or infamous for this quip, which he may not actually have made, about Western civilization. When asked what he thought of it, he's meant to have said, I think it would be a good idea, which is a nice form of Gandhian irony, if not outright sarcasm. But he does write about Western civilization, or what he calls modern civilization. So in his view, whatever Western civilization was, it had been rendered toothless and hollowed out by modern civilization, which was the civilization of industrial capitalism. And the problem with that form of thinking civilizationally is that the elision of any difference between European or Western civilization on the one hand and industrial capitalism on the other meant that you could pretend that Western civilization was universal and could be transported anywhere in the world. And it became a kind of proselytizing mode of thinking about identity, that eventually everyone would become, in quotes, modern. And modern meant the same thing as Western in some ways. Now, what that idea did, of course, was to set aside religious and other forms of identity, both Christian in the West and Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, etc., Jain in the so-called East. Because the idea of modern civilization supposedly transcended these other forms. And for Gandhi, the problem with this way of thinking was that if you disappeared Western civilization or European culture or whatever you want to call it into modern civilization, modernity, people in the West may, for a while, have been satisfied with the universality of their mission and of themselves, indeed, but they could never maintain control over this industrial capitalist form of modernity. Precisely because it was universal, it would chew up and spit out the traditional civilization or histories of the West and go on to colonize the whole world. Today, it might be, in Gandhi's day, it might be England or America that led the charge for Western civilization as modern civilization. Tomorrow, it could be Japan or India or China. It really didn't matter. So the idea of modern civilization in its industrial capitalist sense was destructive of all civilization of a traditional and inherited kind. At the most, you could make a claim to have produced it. So England produced, supposedly, modern capitalism. Well, today it is no longer at the forefront of that enterprise, and indeed is among its victims. With Brexit, etc., you see all of these things happening in our own day. In that sense, Gandhi was correct. But what interests me about civilizational language is that when it comes to occupy a great deal of textual and intellectual space in the 19th century, already in the late 18th century, but certainly in the 19th century, it represents a way of identification, a way of identifying peoples, cultures, geographies, that is, let us say, profane or secular. And when Islam, for instance, gets refigured in the 19th century as a civilization, it has automatically become secularized. And in a way, the problem that those Muslim thinkers who imagine Islam civilizationally face is what to do with the theological element, because it has necessarily been subordinated to this profane or secular category. Indeed, the more expansive Islam becomes as a civilization, where its proponents, for instance, will say, well, we have Islamic science and Islamic technology, going back to your comments, and there are, art and architecture. To this day, we have this strange term, Islamic art and Islamic architecture, which doesn't mean what you might think it means. When we talk about Christian art, we don't mean art produced by Christians. We mean art that is actually religious in nature, and that can be used in rituals of worship, right? But when we're talking about Islamic art, we mean any sort of art. It doesn't need to have any religious purpose at all, right? It's simply produced in Muslim context or by Muslims. And so you see already, in contrast with Christianity, Islam has been strangely secularized in this manner, right? You can't think of civilization without demography, without cartography, without science, without mathematics, without all of these things. And it's impossible to actually fold all those things back into a theological understanding of the world or identify them with religious practices in any way. By the 20th century, this civilizational way of thinking about Islam, and not only Islam, other religions also have it, is replaced by an ideological way of thinking about them. So you shift from civilization to ideology. And suddenly, if we stick with Islam as an example, Muslim thinkers, especially Islamist ones, start thinking about Islam on the model of communism as an ideology. Occasionally fascism too, right? Again, not just for Islam. And an ideology offers certain advantages to civilization because it is much more extensively systematized. It's coherent in a systematic way. It's not simply a historical jumble of things that have come together. Right? And it has a logic of its own, and it has, as it were, a vision and a telos of its own. It produces stuff. And you can see why this happens. This happens with the rise of communism and eventually of fascism and other ideologies in the 20th century, especially after the Russian Revolution. So by the end of the First World War, ideology becomes the way of thinking that appeals to people all over the world. So Islam shifts from civilizational to ideology. Now, in our own time, you see something quite interesting happening. The language of ideology seems to have fallen on hard times after the end of the Cold War. Communism is no longer there, which is a systematized ideological form, unlike capitalism, right? And capitalism might be much more capacious and triumphant, but it doesn't present itself in this kind of systematic way through a dialectical philosophy, etc. So you have the kind of waning, in a way, of these ideological ways of thinking about religion or identity or geography, and you have the return of civilization, not only in Asia, but perhaps even more importantly in Europe and to some degree in North America. The sociologist Olivier Roy, the French sociologist, made in passing, but this quite wonderful argument about why it is that modern Europe, or people in modern Europe, are so fixated with the idea of their civilizational integrity. Immigrants are a threat because they represent some other kind of culture, and often the word culture rather than civilization is used. Right? And our culture, which of course is understood not ideologically precisely, but as a kind of ragtag set of historical values, values being the appropriate word, secularism among them, chief perhaps among them, but others as well, gender equality, etc., etc. All of these are set against the presumed negative values of the immigrant as conceived in this narrative. And what Olivier Roy points out is that the fixation on culture and civilization in European history only makes sense in the context of the formation of the European Union, when traditional forms of nation-state sovereignty have been attenuated. So how do you actually present yourself politically? What kind of political identity is now appropriate in this new situation? You no longer have a currency of your own. You have national armies, but they are more or less subordinated to pan-European policies. You no longer have your own bank. You have a European central bank. You have open borders. You no longer have closed borders. Thus the anxiety about immigration, even though those open borders are internal and not external. And in all these ways, you set up a situation in which what is required is precisely a non-national or a pan-national set of ideas about politics and identity. And those happen to be provided by the old language of culture and civilization. So it's doing interesting work, this term, today. In North America, you have, again, very, very fascinating, I think, for the first time in a while, the importation of these European debates. It used to be the case through much of the Cold War that you had a process of Americanization, mostly through American forms of industrial capitalism, where Europe was Americanized, and there were all these fears about Europe's Americanization through popular culture, Coca-Cola and Hollywood and all the rest. Today you see the reverse. You see European debates being adopted in America, or the Americas, at least North America. And though in Europe these concerns take their context and meaning from the EU and the attenuation of sovereignty, in North America, that context, of course, doesn't exist. It's a very different situation. Nevertheless, the same kinds of debates, including over immigration, play themselves out there as well. So, are we really in a new civilizational age today, both in the so-called West, as well as among the Russians and the Chinese? And what's going to happen? And does this happen because of the decline of ideological forms of thinking? And if so, how are we to consider these new civilizational narratives, which are not the kind of thing that Gandhi was talking about when he spoke of Western civilization as a good idea?
Yeah, on that note, Professor, one of my curiosities is when you talk about industrial capitalism sort of hollowing out what is the traditional cultural values of the West. for me, I'm curious about what those values are. One way of articulating it is looking at the values of equality, egalitarianism, and so on and so forth. The other proposition I have is that it could be the concept of the institution, because I mean, like I keep going back to Kant's essay on what is enlightenment, which I take as sort of programmatically pronouncing these values and announcing that the entity called an institution. And while he begins with the example of a church, but it could also be anything. It could be the army or whatever. My curiosity is, number one, to first of all pin down what those values are, and secondly, if the value is contained within, if you like, institutional culture, can we now propose that there is something uniquely Western about the institutional culture, or in which case we shouldn't be very surprised if nowadays there is a degrading of democracy and other institutions in many countries which don't belong to the West as such. And we should see that as a natural course where these countries are sort of just relapsing back into some of their own native forms of ways of life and culture. So, what are your thoughts on that?
That's interesting. I mean, in a way, perhaps Weber is the great thinker of institutions. As forms that are deliberately severed from individual motives and desires, and that are meant to exist universally, that is to say, to be the same for everyone, and act neutrally. And this, of course, is part and parcel of a certain way of thinking about liberalism, in which the state itself is meant to be a neutral third party, there to mediate between its subjects construed as specific interests and as particularities. So the state represents the universal, and ordinary people represent particularity. Yeah. And the state, through its institutions, either directly political institutions or the institutions it regulates and accredits, like courts, is meant to represent universality, and in its its form is neutrality, the equal treatment of all. Yeah. And of course, this is presented as a great victory, because it apparently allows for the equal treatment of all. But yet, as Gandhi, to invoke him again, recognized already in Hind Swaraj in 1909, this way of regulating people and societies was distinctly hierarchical, because it privileged the state and its institutions above society, though the individuals who formed society were nevertheless meant to give rise to these institutions and the state that superintended them. But even worse, in Gandhi's view, this way of thinking reduced such individuals, and therefore the societies in which they existed, to forms of mere particularity, which disallowed any real engagement by them in the universal tasks of the state, that they had only to be managed by and through these institutions, and to set aside their own particularities and their desires and all the rest as being always insufficient and prejudicial to the goodness of the whole. And so this distinction between the universal and particular is, I suspect, what allows institutions in the West, let's say, to be thought of in certain ways. And figures like Gandhi, but also Tolstoy, from whom he drew great inspiration, perhaps the greatest inspiration of all was Tolstoy, not Ruskin or Thoreau or anyone else, sought to repoliticize the social, precisely the realm of particularity. And their fear was a standard fear from the late 19th century, which is that of the dehumanizing role of institutions and their inability to treat individuals as individuals, but only as cogs in a kind of machine, institutional machine. And that institutions could become all-powerful and be very, very dangerous. So on the one hand, they were unable to be flexible and therefore to take conditions and contexts into account. And on the other hand, they represented precisely this kind of machine which just ran roughshod over everyone. And that an institutionalized way of thinking in this sense, by treating its objects or patients or clients as mere particularities, was able to do great violence to them and sometimes to dispense with them altogether, right? Because they were just numbers. Each one was equivalent to every other one, right? And the thing about the particularity of interest is that from the point of view of the institution, say a court, they're meant to draw no real distinction. Each particular interest is equivalent to every other interest, and these interests must be weighed. Those that are found wanting might be dispensed with altogether. So by the time you come to the Second World War, these fears are manifested in very real ways through the machinery of killing that turns German institutions into genocidal
Machines.
mechanisms. Yeah. And you have figures like the political philosopher Hannah Arendt, who dwell extensively on this phenomenon in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, which deals with the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who had been instrumental in the Holocaust. She writes that Eichmann thought that he was not guilty, that he had done only what any bureaucrat should do, and he had been imperviously neutral, and he didn't see these people as people. They were just the kinds of material that institutions processed, and he had no particular feeling one way or the other. He represented the universal. In fact, at one point in her book, since you began your question with Kant, Eichmann refers to Kant, right? And Arendt points out how Eichmann is actually perversely correct in his reference to Kant, that he has, as Kant advised, identified the particularity of his own will with the universality of the law, right? And therefore, by erasing his own individuality, he was capable of authorizing the egregious and excessive violence that he did without any bad conscience in doing so. He had become fully an institutional man.
I just wanted to note the coincidence that when I was in Frankfurt and I went to the Jewish Museum, there was this wall where I told you they picked out some statement that Kant made against, caricaturing the Jews, and they pasted it as, the signature of that kind of anti-Semitism. So yeah, there's probably something there. Yeah. In fact, I mean, I just wanted to sort of summarize the essence of the point, because that was quite revealing for me. I hadn't thought of this direction, because in essence, as you're saying that the very fact that you treat individuals as mere particulars means that there's actually a direct line from Kant to what is called the calculus of consequentialism, because there you are, as you say, weighing questions of morality by very petty calculations, and from then you then degenerate into the absolute dispensability of individuals, as it happens in fascism and stuff. So yeah, that makes sense to quite a bit. But yeah, I mean, for me the interesting question is, as you say, the question of the alternative, if you like, because you've already talked about, for example, in your work on Gandhi, uh, how instead of looking at moral questions as questions where we seem to have all the knowns figured out and then start from do mathematical calculations or formal calculations, you have to take in the question of ignorance, as you point out. Would you say that that is then this gesture where you're saying that there is a necessity for that kind of theological thinking, if you like, if you take this consideration of our ignorance as being essential to our moral endeavor, is that the theological direction then that in some sense, well, you wouldn't, I don't know if you say that, but is being offered to the world also, right? Not just India, like, right?
Yeah, I think sticking with Gandhi, yes, he is making it, if you will, an offer to the world, but he doesn't expect it to be taken up in the same way everywhere. And there are different ways in which you can understand, say, nonviolence. But to address your question directly, I mean, you know, Gandhi is very interesting because though he constantly says that he is a devout Hindu, which he certainly is, when he talks about his devotion, he talks or writes about it in a way that can equally be understood in non-theological terms. You don't need to share his devotion in order to agree with him or understand him. And this is not simply a function of being able to do what I just suggested, of reinterpreting what he says in your own circumstances. That, of course, also exists because everyone has their own dharma, everyone has their own duty or obligation, which they must define given their particular circumstances. But what I think is very interesting about Gandhi is that he always speaks at more than one level of understanding, because he knows that he has to appeal to a multiple set of constituents, and they don't all agree on things, and nor does he want them or need them to agree on everything. That would be a vision of horror. For him, one of the things that is important and good about India is its plurality. A society that holds together not despite its plurality, but because of it. Because of it, which is to say, it is the kind of plurality that allows for extraordinary intellectual, moral, and philosophical engagements that no kind of homogeneous society would permit. And one of his criticisms of what he calls a modern civilization and what you might call institutionalization has to do precisely with its effort to homogenize. So for him, India is important in this way, but that also means that he has to speak in a multiplex fashion to different groups, that his words always bear more than one meaning, which has often led Gandhi's critics to think of him as a hypocrite. I think I cannot know what his own intentions were, but when you look at his words, they are coherent. They don't betray hypocrisy in the sense that he's saying one thing to one person and another thing to someone else. But his understanding of the theological, therefore, often comes down to incalculability. So if the logic of institutions is about calculation, and calculation is linked to instrumentality, institutions are about instrumentality, and so is politics increasingly. How do you limit the violent logic of this process? It's necessary in some respects, but Gandhi thinks it should not be allowed to take over all social relations or all societies, because we cannot think instrumentally, and we should not think instrumentally about each other if we are to be moral beings. But the logic of politics and institutions is purely instrumental and based on calculability. So for him, the theological represents the incalculable, that which sets a limit, an inevitable and necessary limit to calculability. And he says as much, when the unexpected happens, which it always does, despite all our efforts, including when we have some object in mind and we instrumentally work to achieve that object, the achievement of that object often ends up in the incalculable, because we are surprised by what we ourselves have achieved. It brings to light something that we had not seen or predicted before. And Gandhi routinely calls this the presence of the incarnation of Vishnu on earth. That is what incarnation means. When there is trouble, there is a problem, and suddenly it is resolved, despite what you have wanted, what you have intended, or what you want to do, or what you have indeed done. The incarnation of God on earth is the representation of the incalculable in human life and history and society. And he sees that everywhere. That the work of calculation in its instrumentality can never be successful. It would be horrific if that success were indeed assured. And this way of thinking, of course, Gandhi is getting from the Bhagavad Gita. It's teaching of nishkam karma, that desireless action. Desireless in the sense that it shouldn't be instrumental, it shouldn't be about desiring some future. You should act morally because it is moral to act that way in the present and live in the present. And when you act in and for the present, not only do you inhabit the present, really, rather than constantly sacrificing it for the future, but you open up the future. You allow for many more future possibilities than are available or that become available when you try to plot it out and determine it in advance. First of all, that rarely ever succeeds. Secondly, even when it succeeds, it gives you an unpleasant surprise often at the end because you cannot calculate it. And that is where God comes into the picture. That is the incarnation of Vishnu.
That's, in fact, can I say that as opposed to the logic of calculability, the other possibility, the resourceful possibility, if I can roughly call it the dialectical imagination, and I can say that, let's say it works in how you've looked at Gandhi's use of violence and how concept of non-violence and how it is intimately connected to the concept of violence. You've also looked in the way you've looked at the idea of violence in Islam, and you've also speculated that it could now morph into a non-violent form. Could you say that the dialectical imagination is a kind of resource that an intellectual resource that is present in this kind of theological imagination, or if you like, a roughly theological philosophy? Number one. And number two, is there even within the Western, this history of Kant and Weber, is there a dialectical moment they are missing by any chance? Like, if you like, because the question can be that instead of looking at the East for suggestions and solutions, is there a possible dialectical moment within them? Like, if you could.
Yeah, that's a difficult one.
So,
I mean, in a way, I'm, and I shouldn't be if I'm a good reader of Gandhi, but because he's not really a dialectical thinker. But I was born and brought up in a socialist country, Tanzania, and so I was exposed from childhood to initially to Marx, Engels, Lenin, etc., and then only later to their master Hegel, whom I read once my family had migrated to North America. But so I can't help but being attracted to dialectical forms of thinking. But of course, these tend to be teleological. They might not be instrumental, because Hegel sees the movement of the world spirit not through plotting and planning, but rather the reverse, right? That Napoleon doesn't know what he's actually doing. Well, he might get some glimpse of what he represents. But it's not like he's deliberately going about instrumentally creating a future which is the future of the world spirit. That happens, as it were, behind people's backs, as Hegel says, and it's the cunning of history. So the agency behind that teleology remains mysterious and somewhat theological for Hegel, and to some degree for Marx as well, because they're trying to think of structural agency. Obviously, they don't want to think of individuals or even groups planning something, which would simply be a conspiracy.
Yeah.
So how do you think of structural agency without thinking theologically, in a way, becomes a interesting and important question.
Yeah, sure.
So the teleology of at least these forms of dialectical thinking are strangely not instrumentalizable in the way that we tend to think of instrumentalism. And yet they remain teleological in a way that someone like Gandhi would not have been perhaps happy with, because he wanted to multiply the number of ends that were possible in any given future. So dialectical thinking really offers us a great deal. As a historian, I'm also partial to it because, of course, it's all about history. It doesn't have to be. I mean, there are ways of thinking dialectically which are not historical. But in Hegel and Marx, they are, of course, out and out historical. And you see history as it are conforming to a pattern, which makes for a telos. And yet it is the telos that is both necessary, for instance, freedom as a telos. It might also be a theologically construed telos, salvation as a form of freedom, as a theological understanding of freedom, whether it's mukti. Mukti is an interesting term, for instance, because, of course, and it's Sridhar Kaviraj who has written about this, how mukti as a purely theological form of individual salvation in Hinduism becomes politicized and becomes a political term in the Bangladesh war, in the struggle. So it's Muslim Bengalis who turn mukti from a theological into a political term, the mukti bahini, right? And so there is something really extraordinary that happens at that moment, where you see before your eyes the shift from a classic theological category to a political one. So forms of teleology, in other words, are not just do not just exist parallel to one another, but they actually can influence one another, and one can turn into another. So all I can say is that it makes me wonder whether dialectical forms of thinking can, on the one hand, be de-instrumentalized because the instrumentality is structural, and on the other hand, that their teleological ends can therefore also be rendered multiplex, as with mukti in the example I offered, and relatively ambiguous, so as not to give the critics of dialectical thinking the kind of credibility that they would like to possess, which is dialectics is terrible because it seeks to iron out all of history and its messiness into one line, which is instrumentalist and teleological, and those are obviously both bad things. So I think that there are more resources in dialectical thinking than we are aware of, and of course there are more ways of thinking dialectically than I am aware of. I'm thinking of Adorno's early book on dialectical thinking. I think it's Adorno, and he talks about Greek, Socratic dialectics, which are obviously very different and are not historical from Hegel and Marx. So that is not a history I'm, entirely familiar with. I only know it in broad outline. And I mention it only so as to hope for another kind of future for dialectical thought. What's problematic about it in current times, of course, is that it often becomes conspiratorial when when it is understood as being the product of intentions and motivations, and therefore divorced from its, if you will, theological element, and when it is understood as being unilinear. And both of those problems are dealt with by people like Gandhi.
True. And in fact, that brings me to a particular question about method, because this is my, and I'm saying this deliberately, not as a person who researches history, but as somebody who is deeply interested in ideas in general from all fields. If you, as you said, you're a historian, and this has been a rich resource for you when it comes to thinking in history. For me, I wouldn't say that it's a point of aversion, but if you look at the Indian academia, it is too, dominated, if you like, by certain tropes or styles, like people call themselves post-colonial thinkers or subaltern thinkers. Well, some of them say they are Marxist thinkers, and well, I mean, they can find some way to connect themselves also to dialectic thinking, but I think my diagnosis is that it is precisely, if I may say so, that because of your involvement in the dialectical imagination of that thought process, that has also influenced your, the way in which you don't seem to take easy political stands on many issues. I'm sure that has a connection with that. Whereas, at least, well, again, the debate is in academia whether you should be political or not, and some people will say we should be. But I think in Indian academia, I think suffers a lot from this. It's a sociological fact of Indian academia that I think maybe missing the richness of dialectical thinking, they are too, restricted to these groups, and they just repeat certain tropes, which sort of, I think, cloud the sort of new work, novelty from coming in. What is your thought on this? I'm sure you have many friends and colleagues who have worked in these areas, but still.
No, I agree entirely with what you say. Even at the most superficial level, in the back and forth on social media increasingly, but also in the press, and of course in person, the back and forth of claims and counterclaims of a political nature ends up being remarkably dull because repetitive. I understand that there is a necessity for it, but that is a propagandistic necessity. No one ever wins arguments on this basis. Yeah. Right? There is no, especially on social media, knockout punch. There's always more data, more links, more information, newer iterations of an argument, etc., to be made. So arguments are not won by being engaged in this manner. There might, as I said, be a necessity to repeat them for propagandistic purposes in order to gain followers or create solidarities and to hammer down a way of thinking. But that is part of an organizational project and is not necessarily intellectually very interesting in its own right. And if you are thinking dialectically, or I should hope philosophically in any way, then I think you are obliged to think anew about the very categories you and I and all of us deploy. As a historian, I'm also worried when these categories are taken as being invariable, because all categories being historical are changing and are open-ended. So you can't simply say this is an example of colonialism. It may be, but if it exists 100 years later in a quite different context, its meaning has also changed. Right? Settler colonialism in the 17th, 16th and 17th centuries in the Americas must be very different from settler colonialism in the 20th or 21st centuries. Right? Something has changed in the meantime. Many things have changed in the meantime. What the dialectical thinkers of the past, including and especially the Marxists, did, figures like Marx and Lenin themselves, is not being done by those who claim to be their descendants today. They are not rethinking these terms and categories. They are not showing us how they have come to adopt new meanings. They are not, in other words, being dialecticians, the so-called descendants of such thinkers. And of course, this remains true of the anti-Marxists and the anti-leftists and all the rest as well. So that has always bothered me, that way of thinking propagandistically. While I acknowledge the necessity for organizational purposes of propaganda, right? But if it is delinked from any new thinking, then we are in big trouble, because then we don't really understand our own times and how change actually occurs. We just simply refer back to the past. And indeed, there's very little futural imagination. I mean, I wonder if it's in part because the future as we tend to think of it today is dystopian, whether it's climate change or, a few decades back, nuclear war, which is another mode of apocalyptic thinking. The apocalypse has returned to our historical imaginations, right? And that's another sign of the, if you will, return of the theological element to all our lives, right? For a long time, for hundreds of years, the apocalyptic and the theological, therefore, elements had been exiled from politics and history, from secular politics and history. And we had precisely these teleological narratives where we're all going to end up in a classless society, or, I don't know, a liberal one or something or other. But at least since the end of the Second World War and the emergence of atomic threat, and since then, with the end of the Cold War, with the emergence of the climate change threat, we have apocalypse and apocalyptic thinking back with us. So when you have the apocalypse hanging over you like this, in a way, our ways of thinking about good futures become reduced, and they often turn to the past. So it's a question of the return of welfarism, of the welfare state, or of civil liberties, or of something like that. There's no great adventure built into these visions. They might be perfectly decent and good visions, but they are oddly removed from history, or rather they're throwbacks to an earlier history. They don't represent a future in any sense. And if I'm right, one reason for that may be because the future writ large is always dystopian and apocalyptic. So I think it's within that context that you have the uncreative reliance on propagandistic terms that are taken mostly from the past. Now, you mentioned postcolonialism and subaltern studies, which are very interesting, and they're not part of this dystopian imagination. But they're distinct. I mean, subaltern studies was the only Indian intellectual movement that goes abroad and that really makes itself at home and is accepted elsewhere. Of course, Indian forms of spirituality have done that since the 19th century. And Gandhi and nonviolence similarly had a global trajectory, right? So I'm not saying there are no Indian forms of thought or practice that, go abroad to gain adherence. But in terms of scholarship, subaltern studies is the only one I can think of. But it changed when it went abroad. And when a number of its epigones moved initially from India to Australia and then often to North America, because there it was received, especially in the United States, in another context where a form of Hegelian thinking that specifically devoted to the politics of recognition and representation was dominant. And it had to do with race and gender, especially in American life. And subaltern studies got adopted by and co-opted by, despite itself, this form of thinking. I mean, the most crucial text in the introduction of subaltern studies to the American Academy and therefore to the West writ large was that volume Selected Subaltern Studies, edited by Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak, with an introduction by Gayatri Spivak, in which she summarized and historicized, in a way, the subaltern studies enterprise. Right? And that is what, as it were, leads it to feed into or become part of something called postcolonialism, which is not a term that was, to my recollection, used very much earlier in subaltern studies, in the subaltern studies journal and collective from in and from India. So subaltern studies changes and as it becomes a kind of global form, and that is as it should be. It lost something, it also gained something. But post-colonialism today has itself been supplanted here and there by something called decoloniality. And I just find it very interesting. It's a very 90s phenomenon, 80s and 90s phenomenon, the reliance on the post-structuralism, postmodernism, post-colonialism. Of course, in the old subaltern studies days in India, the accent was on post, not on colonialism. Because the object of inquiry was the post-colonial nation state, was nationalism. Partha Chatterjee's first big book is on nationalism in the colonial world, admittedly, but it was on nationalism. Once subaltern studies arrived in America, it suddenly became about colonialism, and so is decoloniality. Right? So the national movement has been erased. So what subaltern studies was trying to do, in my view, was problematize the national movement and see its limitations. Right? What post-colonialism does in the US and elsewhere in the West is to think about colonialism, to erase nationalism, and with it to erase the moment of national freedom and independence, as if it were a mist before the sun of empire, right? And you're back to empire. So you have Hart and Negri writing their book Empire, which is again not about the colonial empires, but about the postmodern moment as a form of empire in its own right. But that too erases anti-colonialism and its history, and erases nationalism and its problematic history. And I'm not really very comfortable with that. It doesn't make me very happy because I think something is being erased and elided which shouldn't be. Not because I think it's particularly valuable, but because really you cannot think of our times and modern or contemporary history without it. And in doing so, there's a return back to this older form of empire and of coloniality, as if it were undifferentiated. And with decoloniality, we then have a kind of element of nativism creeping in, that we need to recover what we lost, or we need to take the remnants of indigeneity and make them into something else. Now, those ways of thinking may have some meaning in parts of Latin America, for instance. No doubt they have meaning in Asia and Africa as well. But I'm not entirely trusting of the meanings they possess, because we have seen this story unfold before of indigeneity and claims to authenticity. So that is not something that inspires much confidence in me either. So that's as far as academic politics are concerned in terms of academic movements. In terms of political categories more generally, we also see the return of the repressed, that is to say, the return of historical categories in a context, as I suggested, where the future remains dystopian. So it's not something that is satisfying, and it's not something that I think is intellectually productive at all. If we refuse to question our inherited categories and refuse to see them as being open-ended and refuse to think them anew, then we're trapped. And I might have very strong views supporting some political event or struggle and not another one. But I think it is incumbent upon intellectuals, and everyone else for that matter, to approach these struggles by looking at them anew rather than by seeing them as yet another instantiation of some familiar thing that we know already.
Okay, so just in continuation to what you were just now saying, wouldn't you say that post-colonial movements were actually looking at colonialism as the one which brings in all these nationalistic categories? So insofar as that, it is interrogating colonialism's role in what subaltern studies, for instance, takes for granted as nationalism as something that's there and needs to be problematized. However, the post-colonial thinkers are saying, okay, let's take it further back and saying this common sense of nationalism, where does even that come from? Insofar as that, don't you think it even problematizes maybe what subaltern studies would have in the initial years taken for granted?
Yeah, I mean, subaltern studies had set itself a remit that was deliberately constrained temporally. You know, they dealt with the 19th and 20th centuries basically. They didn't go further than that. And it was at least initially constrained also in terms of the kinds of things they looked at. So famously or infamously, caste was not among the subjects that the subalternists dealt with in any serious way, or for that matter, communalism or community histories. Occasionally they came in. Gandhi wrote a whole book about it, right? But you know, that's normal in any intellectual project. You can't do everything, and you're focusing on some things. In this case, these are thinkers who came out of Indian Marxism, and their very title, subaltern, of course, they get out of Gramsci. But that Gramscian reference seems to have withered on the vine. You know, I mean, it hasn't been taken forward, in part because when it transited into post-colonialism and its American politics of recognition and representation, that bit was left behind. So if you will, the more political bit in the Indian context of subaltern studies was lost. It took on another political valence of a kind in America. But in America, intellectuals are not engaged politically in the same way as they are in India. Right? That is changing these days, but historically it's not really been the case. But what is gained by this movement is the question you're asking me. And I guess a lot is, in the sense that we are being encouraged to think about the return of empire not only as a dated term that ignores the role of the national movements in decolonization. That is also the case. But we're encouraged to think about new forms of empire as well. And that is surely an important project. So I don't think Hart and Negri's book Empire is an unimportant book, for instance. Right? I might not be convinced by it for other reasons. So there's nothing illegitimate about that project. It's just that I feel sometimes that, especially when it comes to current political events, the terminology from these intellectual debates is just sort of freeze-dried, as it were, and deployed. So in the case of postmodernism, it is, if the modern represents the idea of fundamental cleavage and break in history, how can you think of another subsequent break in history without simply repeating the role of modernity, the intellectual epistemological role that the modern plays in conceptions of history? And postmodernism, in one of its senses, gestures in its very name to that impossibility. Postmodern doesn't mean you move beyond the modern. It means you have certainly put in question, but you cannot exit its influence. That's why you have no name for it of its own. It must be linked back to the name modern or modernism. And you may say similar things about post-colonialism and possibly post-structuralism as well, though I'm not entirely sure about that one. So the work that these terms, post hyphen whatever comes after that, does has an epistemological dimension that's about the inability to exit, as much as the irrelevance in some senses, or at least the historicization of the term that you're unable to exit, right? So these terms represent a kind of double bind, and that's what's interesting about them. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier in my comments. Our inability to exit in a way, and the kind of repetitive, compulsive behavior that academic politics, especially, takes on as a consequence.
Okay, this is about, again, going back to Gandhian thought. I was wondering, how is Gandhi's critique of the state, how does it compare, for instance, to the communist rejection of the Western idea of the state, or the relationship of these modern non-state actors, their lack of reliance on state, for instance, like the ISIS or any of the, even Hamas, for instance. So is there any similarity in their critiques of the state, or is it very, very, I mean, I'm assuming that it's very different, so I was wondering if you could lay out something about that.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, there's a lovely anecdote when the president of the Muslim League asks Gandhi what he thought of Lenin. And Gandhi's response is to say that I would begin where Lenin ends. That is to say, with the withering away of the state. All right. And Gandhi, and that, the withering of the state, of course, is the anarchist element in Bolshevism. But it has been buried so deeply within Lenin and his form of communism as to be practically unattainable. And so it's a presupposition in communism that you need to work towards the withering away of the state. It's an anarchist idea, but you never ever get there. And Gandhi, being Gandhi, saw this right away and said, I would begin where he ends, because Lenin is never going to get to that end. And for Gandhi, as we know, things were immediate. Right? As he says in Hind Swaraj, the moment you start non-cooperating, non-violently, you're free. You're already free, even if the country is not yet free. Individually, you're free. You have it in the palm of your hand. And that is a nice way of anarchistic thinking. So in that sense, Gandhi was, as he called himself, a philosophical anarchist. He did want either the withering away of the state and a society that ran itself through its own institutions, or at the very least a kind of limitation of the state as a form of violence, right? Even though it might be necessary in some respects. Now, so he's linked to a whole set of anarchist thinkers, and I'm always surprised that we don't read Gandhi with anarchism, whereas I think we should, instead of reading him with spiritualists. Right? With Muslim movements, it's not accidental that this question was asked of Gandhi by the president of the Muslim League, right? Who was not an Islamist by any means. He was a so-called modernist, a liberal. But in Muslim thought too, you have at the same time the development of these anarchistic themes. And I'm increasingly coming to think that whereas anarchism was destroyed in the West, in part by communism, by the success of the Russian Revolution, it survived in the colonial world, in Asia and Africa, intellectually and to some degree politically. A lot of Gandhi's movements are necessarily anarchistic. A, because they are launched against the state, the colonial state, and B, because he places so much emphasis on individual practices. And with Islamists, the first one arguably is also Indian, he's called Maududi, Abul Ala Maududi. And in the non-cooperation movement, he's a Gandhian. He writes an adulatory biography of Gandhi. He writes two. One of Madan Mohan Malviya, the founder of BHU, as we know, which exists, and I've read it. The other is of Gandhi, which is considered so seditious it's destroyed by the British, and so it doesn't exist, although maybe Maududi's private papers has his, it contains the manuscript of it. This is the man who founded Islamism, which is a global phenomenon now. And Maududi goes on to repudiate Gandhi much later, but he keeps many Gandhian practices, many of which are anarchistic. And in the Islamist case, anarchism is expressed in its distrust of sovereignty. Right? So famously, for people like Maududi, but also Sayyid Qutb in Egypt, another important Islamist thinker, sovereignty belongs to God alone. What they mean when they say this is that we must expel sovereignty from human affairs. That the concept of sovereignty is theological, as someone like Carl Schmitt was already saying in the 1930s, 20s and 30s, right? It's a theological category because in its Hobbesian form, even indeed in the form that Jean Baudin gives it earlier, it is so absolute, it implies a power so peremptory and absolute as not to be possible of any human person or assembly. It can only therefore be a divine power. It's modeled on divine power. And because it is modeled on divine power as a theological category, it cannot be exercised by human beings. So when Maududi says sovereignty belongs to God, what I think he means by it is that we must get rid of it from human affairs. Only we expel it. The problem then comes to be, how are we to construe human flourishing in social terms without sovereignty? It's an anarchistic problem. It's an anarchistic question. And he has various ways of answering that question. Gandhi answers it through the social basis of caste, which he wants to strip of its hierarchical function but maintain otherwise, and of other forms of community, urban allegiances in villages. We often tend to think of Gandhi's fixation on the village as being distinctive and unrelated to everything else. In fact, for Gandhi, the village is like caste, is like community, it's like neighborhood. These are all social institutions which allow Indians to govern themselves. Right? They have problems, all of them, which can and should be resolved. Right? Maududi similarly thinks that in Muslim social life, you have certain forms of what it called law, but are in fact very often practices. They're not law in the liberal sense of being authorized by the state as a neutral third party, etc. And then these forms of law allow Muslim societies to self-govern outside the state and beyond the state. And so that's where his repudiation of sovereignty takes him. So in both cases, and they are linked because Maududi was a follower of Gandhi's in the non-cooperation movement. You have the development of new forms of anarchistic thinking. And that I think is fascinating. With Al-Qaeda and ISIS, with Al-Qaeda, there is no desire for a state. In fact, they want to destroy states from within, socially, not by an army. They never had an army. ISIS is different because it actually constructs a state. All right? It's a weird kind of state because it depends upon people coming in from all over the world, and it has ever expanding borders or ever shrinking ones, but they use the name of the state, Dawla. Right? So there you get back to some version, however strange or novel, of statist thinking. And I think that's because ISIS represents a regionalization and a territorialization of militancy, whereas Al-Qaeda was much more global and was displaced, which had no center to it. In that sense, I suppose it could be understood as anarchistic in some ways, but of course not anything that Gandhi would have approved of, nor indeed would Maududi have approved.
So much of politics in contemporary India is in a way shaped by religion and religious discourses. How has Gandhi contributed to religionizing the politics in India? What is his role? How do you assess that and evaluate that?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, Gandhi's famous or infamous for supposedly introducing religion into politics. That accusation was first made by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, right? Again, in the Khilafat movement. Jinnah was not a fan of the Khilafat movement, though he contributed to it in various ways. But he thought Gandhi had brought religion into politics. The irony of that statement, of course, is evident because it was Jinnah who then ends up creating a state on the basis of religion in some respect, though he doesn't think that's what he's doing. So it's an old claim made about Gandhi. But I suppose Gandhi might answer that he is simply using the language of everyday life, and that it is impossible to separate and segregate these terms, and that he uses them differently. Indeed, he transforms them, right? So that Gandhi's use of the term Brahma Raja is not what people meant before Gandhi when they talked about Ram Raja. Right? When he talks about the incarnation of God on earth, he's certainly not talking about what people had understood previously as being the incarnation of God on earth. Of course, he conducts certain religious practices, but not others. So Gandhi's ashrams are quite interesting. They have no statuary, there are no idols, there are no temples. It's kind of almost a nirgun form, but it isn't, because he also is devoted to actual deities like Krishna, right? But if I'm correct, some of his religious practices are drawn from his mother, who was a pranami, and the pranamis are a group of people who don't have temples and statuary, right? And who worship both the Gita and the Quran, right? That's Gandhi's mother's tradition. So the religion that Gandhi spoke of and practiced is distinctive in its own way. Yes, there's the Gita. Yes, there are the epics. Yes, there are bhajans and all the rest. And yes, there are celebrations and commemorations of various Hindu festivals. But they're all done in a quite distinctive way. But that is part of ordinary life. And for Gandhi, ordinary life is important precisely because it is from ordinary life that he draws his cases, his examples, his categories, and to ordinary life that he appeals. As an anarchist thinker, after all, he wants society to govern itself. And it cannot govern itself if you make these separations and segregations so as to create out of society the kind of thing that Ravi was talking about, an institutional. Right? The state as a neutral third party, secular in this sense, institution. That is entirely, or for a large part, divorced from the basis of social life. For Gandhi, this is simply unworkable and dishonest. So you can be religious without that religion being a source of discrimination. And you can be irreligious while practicing such forms of discrimination. So the question lies, I think, not in choosing whether to be religious or not be religious, but in how to ensure that whatever it is that you do and however you identify, you do so in such a way as to remain open and non-discriminatory towards others. So I'm afraid it's not a very satisfactory answer to your question, except to say that Gandhi would have seen it as a piece of hypocrisy to make hard and fast divisions, though he proclaimed his faith in secularism, right? He understood that one's personal religiosity and ability to speak about religion in public life did not entail the rejection or the repudiation of the secular. But what he meant by the secular remains an open question, right? Because he didn't mean by it the absolute separation and segregation of religious themes.
So I think, Professor, maybe one of the, you gave us quite a few resources for novelty. The first, if I may recount, is let's say dialectical imagination. The second, which I found very interesting, was when you were talking about Gandhi's return to the social and the community, and I think from there strands your interest in the everyday also, perhaps, because when you say, I think, in this afterword where the everyday is a source of ideas, like, so in that sense anthropologists are also ethnographers. They are also anthropologists of ideas. They are not just mere ethnographers. So that is another source of novelty, if you like, and these very ideas that you mentioned. So I think that we take home that lesson, if you like, and we are very glad that we have covered so much and touched upon many things. Hopefully we'll be glad to have you back again next time when you're in Bangalore, for sure. And yeah, it was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. A great pleasure for me, and it's always wonderful to engage in conversation with people like yourselves.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.